Hey guys, this is Angie and this is the fabric I'm using for the next quilt. I'm using 5 patterns of fabric and a solid. We need 1 yard of 3 patterns, a half a yard of 2 patterns, and then a yard of solid. The quilt pattern that I'm using is from the Quilts and More magazine. Since I'm a visual person and I struggle with instructions, what I did was I copied the quilt pattern from the magazine, and then I decided where to place my fabric blocks. So I chose the big flower pattern for pattern number 1, that's in the upper left corner. And blocks 2 and 3 I switched after I filmed the video. So the solid blue color is going to be number 2 instead of 3. And then the lines is pattern 3. The chocolate is pattern 4 and the diagonals are pattern 5. And then I'm going to be using eggshell for the white blocks that you see here in the picture. Okay, so next I'm going to press my fabric, but I'm not going to film that step, okay? Okay, we're starting with pattern number 1 and we're going to trim off the selvage. Now we're going to flip this over. Our ends are cleaned up. And our first cut is going to be at 8.5 inches. And we're going to need 2 of those. So this is my 8.5 inch ruler, and I'm just going to make sure that I line everything up perfectly, or as best I can. Okay, now we need a second piece that measures 8.5 inches. So far we've made 2 cuts at 8.5 inches, and next we need to cut at 6.5 inches. And we need 2 strips that measure 6.5 inches. Okay, we're going to start with our 8.5 inch strips, and we need to cut 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 3.5. I'm going to start out by trimming the selvage. Now we're going to cut at the 3.5 inches, and we need 20 of these. You get 2 pieces per cut. So we need to cut this size 10 times. I'm going to fast forward the other 9 times. Okay, so now we've got the 6.5 inch strips, and we're going to cut them at 2.5 inches. We need 20 pieces that measure 6.5 by 2.5. We're going to start out by trimming off the selvage first. Once we've got that done, then we're going to cut at 2.5 inches. So let me turn this over, and I'm going to get my 2.5 inch ruler. Now we're cutting at the 2.5 inches, and I love this little neon ruler for 2.5 inch cuts. As a reminder, we're going to need 20 of these that measure 2.5 by 6.5, and I'm going to fast forward through the cutting. I'm going to cut one and then I'll fast forward. Okay, we're ready for pattern 2, but let's recap pattern 1. We have 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 3.5, and then we have 20 pieces that measure 6.5 by 2.5. We're going to cut pattern 2 now, and I've already cut off the selvage, and we're ready to make our first cut at 12.5 inches. To get 12.5 inches, I'm using 2 rulers. The first ruler is 6.5 inches, and the second ruler I'm lining up at the 6 inch mark to give me 12.5 inches. I learned this technique on YouTube, and I like how accurate it is. So let's go ahead and cut 2 pieces that measure 12.5 inches. I'm going to fast forward through the second cut. Now we're cutting the 12.5 strips at 4.5, and we need 12 of these that measure 12.5 by 4.5. So I'm going to cut this first piece at 4.5, and then I'll fast forward through the rest of them. Okay, so now we need 12 pieces that measure 4.5 by 2.5. I'm going to take this leftover 12.5 inch strip, and I'm going to cut 2.5 inch strips, and then we're going to cut those down to measure 2.5 by 4.5. So I'm going to line this up as best I can. Sometimes it's hard to line up lines with lines. I'm just making sure it's lined up, and then cut at 2.5. I'm going to fast forward through the rest of them. Okay, we need to cut these 2.5-inch strips at 4.5 inches, and we need 12 of them. So I'm going to make my first cut here at 4.5, and I'm going to cut the first one here and then fast forward through the rest because again they measure 4.5 by 2.5 and we need 12 of them. We're done with pattern 2, and here's a recap. We've cut 12 pieces that measure 12.5 by 4.5 and 12 pieces that measure 4.5 by 2.5. Okay, so now we're on pattern 3 and we need to cut 2 pieces at 12.5 inches. I'll make the first cut and then fast forward. Okay, so now we're cutting the 12.5-inch pieces at 4.5. So we need 12 of those that measure 12.5 by 4.5. I'll make this first cut and then I'll fast forward through the rest of them. Okay, so now we need 12 pieces cut at 2.5 and then by 4.5. So I'm going to make the 2.5-inch cut first, and I'm just going to cut one of them on camera, and then I'll fast forward the rest, and then I'll be back to cut those strips at 4.5. We're going to cut these 2.5-inch pieces at 4.5, and we need 12 of those. So I'm going to show you this first one, and then I'm going to fast forward through the rest. Okay, so now we're on pattern 4 and we need 8 pieces that measure 12.5 by 4.5. So we're going to cut at 12.5 first, and then our next, that leftover piece there, we're going to cut that at 4.5. And this is one of those fabrics that I mentioned we only needed a half a yard. So I'm going to get my ruler here and slide over my 12.5-inch piece and then cut this remaining piece at 4.5. Just making sure that I've got everything lined up. Now we're taking the 12.5-inch strip and we're cutting it at 4.5 inches. I'm going to film the first cut and then fast forward. And right here, I'm just trying to make sure that I have it lined up exactly before I cut. Okay, so now I have the 4.5-inch strip and I'm cutting it at 2.5, and we need 8 pieces that measure 4.5 by 2.5. I'm going to cut the first one and then fast forward the rest. Okay, so we're on pattern 5 now. We're going to make our first cut at 12.5 inches, and this is just like pattern 4. Okay, our next piece is going to get cut at 4.5 inches, and we just need one of these. Okay, we've got our 12.5-inch strip, and we're cutting it at 4.5 inches. Again, we're going to need 8 of these. I'm going to cut one on camera, and then I will fast forward the rest. Now I'm cutting the 4.5-inch strip at 2.5 inches. Again, we're going to need 8 of those. So I'll cut this first one and then fast forward the rest. Okay, now we're working on our solid fabric. We need 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 4.5. I'm cutting at 8.5. I'll cut the first one on camera, and we need a total of 3 of these strips. Okay, our next cut is at 6.5 inches, and you're going to need 2 of these strips that measure 6.5 inches. Okay, I've got the 8.5-inch strip, and now we're cutting it at 4.5. Again, we need 20 of these that measure 8.5 by 4.5, and I'll cut the first one on camera and fast forward the rest. Now we're cutting our 6.5-inch strip at 4.5, and we need 10 of them. Okay, so here's a recap of our fabric. I'm going to check my notes to make sure I'm telling you the right thing. So pattern 1 has 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 3.5, and then 20 pieces that measure 2.5 by 6.5. Patterns 2 and 3 have the same exact measurements, and I did switch those around. So pattern 2 is 12 pieces that measure 4.5 by 12.5, and 12 pieces that measure 2.5 by 4.5. And then pattern 3, same thing. 12 pieces that measure 4.5 by 12.5, and 12 pieces that measure 2.5 by 4.5. Now we're going to move on to patterns 4 and 5. Those have the exact same measurements. and the same amount of pieces. So we need 8 pieces that measure 4.5 by 12.5 and 8 pieces that measure 2.5 by 4.5. Same thing for pattern 5. 8 pieces that are 4.5 by 12.5 and 8 pieces 2.5 by 4.5. Now we're going to move to our solid. That is going to be 10 pieces that measure 4.5 by 6.5 and then 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 4.5. Okay, so now we're ready to start piecing our blocks together.